I always found the old cabin in the woods behind my neighbor's property unsettling. It was a relic of another time, hidden among dense trees, its wooden beams weathered and warped. My neighbor, Mr. Grayson, was an odd man, quiet, reclusive, the kind of guy you'd see only when he was collecting mail or working in his overgrown garden. People in the neighborhood whispered about him, saying he had a past he didn't talk about. Some claimed he'd inherited the cabin from his great-grandfather, who had disappeared under strange circumstances. I didn't think much of it until one October evening when Mr. Grayson showed up on my doorstep. It was out of character for him. He rarely interacted with anyone. He stood there, his face pale and drawn, his thin frame wrapped in a tattered coat. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's about the cabin." I blinked, caught off guard. "What about it?" "There's something wrong. Something I can't handle alone. Please, just come take a look." I hesitated. There was something in his eyes, a deep primal fear that made my stomach twist. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and followed him. The walk through the woods was silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of damp earth. When we reached the cabin, I was struck by how decrepit it looked up close. The roof sagged, the windows were shattered, and the door hung askew on its hinges. But what struck me the most was the aura of the place. It felt wrong, like the trees themselves leaned away from it, and the shadows around it were darker, thicker than they should be. "What's going on?" I asked, my breath visible in the cold air. Mr. Grayson swallowed hard. "I don't know how to explain it, but I've been hearing things, voices, and last night I saw something inside." A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. "Probably just animals. This place looks like it's been abandoned for decades." He shook his head. "It's not animals." He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside was worse than I'd imagined. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the air was thick with a smell I couldn't quite place, something metallic and sour. The walls were lined with old shelves, their contents long since rotted or rusted. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden trapdoor, its edges worn smooth as if it had been opened and closed countless times. "I think it's coming from down there," Mr. Grayson said, his voice trembling as he pointed to the trapdoor. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight on it. The wood was darkened with age, and deep gouges marred its surface, as if something had clawed at it from below. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay. "Have you opened it?" I asked. He nodded. "Once, and I heard something moving." I stared at him, trying to gauge if he was serious, but the fear in his eyes was genuine, and it made me shiver. "Fine," I said, swallowing my own fear. "Let's open it together." We grabbed the rusted iron handle and pulled. The trapdoor resisted at first, as if something on the other side was holding it shut, but then it gave way with a loud creak, revealing a set of narrow stone steps leading down into darkness. A foul odor wafted up, stronger than before, making my stomach churn. We stood there for a moment, neither of us willing to take the first step. Finally, I clicked on my flashlight and started down, Mr. Grayson following close behind. The air grew colder with each step, the light from the cabin fading until it was just us and the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a large circular chamber. The walls were made of rough stone, and strange symbols were carved into them, their shapes twisting and jagged. In the center of the room was a circle of blackened candles, their wax melted onto the floor. And in the middle of the circle lay something that made my blood run cold. It was a bundle of cloth, old and tattered, and it was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if something inside was breathing. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Mr. Grayson replied, his voice barely audible. "I didn't get this far last time." I inched closer, the beam of my flashlight steady on the bundle. As I reached out to touch it, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bundle twitched violently, and then it began to unravel. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight as the cloth fell away to reveal what was inside. At first I thought it was a child, a small, frail figure curled in the fetal position. But then it moved, unfolding its limbs with an unnatural grace, and I realized it wasn't human. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes black and hollow. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a laugh. "Run," Mr. Grayson whispered, but I was frozen in place. The creature turned its head toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stared at me for a moment, and then it smiled, a horrible, twisted grin that made my stomach churn, and then it lunged. I don't remember much of what happened next. I ran, stumbling up the stairs with Mr. Grayson right behind me. The creature's screams echoed through the cabin as we burst out into the night. We didn't stop running until we were back at my house, slamming the door shut behind us. For a long time, we sat there in silence, catching our breath. Finally, Mr. Grayson spoke. "It won't stop," he said, his voice hollow. "I've tried everything. It always comes back." I looked at him, my blood running cold. "What do you mean?" He met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of his fear. "That thing, it's part of the cabin, part of this land. You can't get rid of it. All you can do is keep it locked away." I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning, Mr. Grayson was gone. His house was empty, the curtains drawn, and the cabin in the woods stood silent and foreboding. I tried to forget about what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every night, I heard noises coming from the woods, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, and every morning I found claw marks on my back door, deep and fresh. And then one night, I woke to the sound of creaking wood. My heart stopped as I realized it was coming from inside the house, from the basement. And the last thing I heard before the light went out was that guttural, twisted laugh.